welcome back. All right, welcome back, everyone. All right, my name is Cynthia. I'm with the Straits Clan team. Tonight, we are excited to have back Feed. So those of you who have been members for a while know Feed is curated by our fabulous members, Sean and Dom, and they put together most interesting current events chats with interesting minds here in Singapore. All right, I won't leave us for too long. I'll let Sean do a little bit more of an intro about Feed and our super exciting speakers tonight. And thanks for joining us.
Yes,
Sean.
Thank you, Cynthia.
Yeah.
Change screen. Okay, change your scene. So, hi everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. Usually we're up in the attic in a room full of about 90 to 100 people, but so this is a new format we're trying out. And thanks very much to Straits Clan for hosting us. And thank you all for joining us as well. So in terms of Project Feed, just to set some context around who we are, for about, I think, 3 years or so now, Dom and I have been doing these fireside chats on technology, ventures, and key events that we believe will drive the future for Singapore and the region. So tonight, we have our guests, but just kind of some logistics. We want to keep this interactive, so maybe in the second half, we'll be taking questions from the chat and we'll be kind of sifting through that. So feel free to chime in then. But let me introduce our session and our guests. So I have right next to me Bjorn, who is the founder of MindFi, which is a meditation app. And he was an ex-enterprise software exec at Zendesk and founded a few startups before deciding to focus on meditation, also as a result of his own personal journey. More about that in a bit. And dialing all the way from Auvergne in his chateau in the rolling hills. Also incidentally, the birthplace of Michelin, if I'm right, of tire and travel guide fame, right? Very on brand for tonight, is Vaughn, the author of The Uncertainty Mindset, and innovation professor at UCL, ex-Googler, and great friend. So thanks for dialing in and joining us in this kind of interesting offline to online setup that we have going here. So just in terms of why we're doing this session, right? So Vaughn had sent me a couple early chapters of his book in his early in the genesis of it, and I thought that it would be really cool to it was a really refreshing take, right, on like, so a lot of us a lot of us watch food media and literature like Mind of a Chef or Chef's Table, or Ugly Delicious, but it's quite rare to have food literature really have a business and corporate innovation layer upon it. So I was really excited, right? And Vaughn and I started talking that, hey, when he's next back in town, we should totally have a feed session up, right here. But the pandemic has changed all that, as well as affected our lives in quite powerful ways, right? So the topic of uncertainty has moved from a kind of, okay, you entertain it once in a while, to something that's actually a reality that all of us can't quite escape from, right? And so tonight is actually a really nice moment to kind of go deeper on that, given that Vaughn's book was just published this summer, so congrats, Vaughn. And also because I felt that there were a lot of parallels with the world of software development, and kind of to provide that perspective beyond as a head of product, and also kind of having had a personal journey that has kind of culminated in his current pursuit in terms of scaling meditation, so to speak, with MindFi. We're delighted to have Bjorn join us. So that's kind of the context for tonight. But I think it'd be much more interesting to dive deep into the key ideas behind the book, and then to riff off from there in terms of the great unknown of what the next hour of your life will look like. So over to Vaughn, who will share some of the, well, he'll kind of give us he'll take us behind the curtain of some of the food R&D labs and endeavors. And I hear that there's a Batoni photo somewhere in there. I'm curious how that worked its way in. So over to you, Vaughn.
Fantastic. So first of all, thanks to Straits Clan, Project Feed, Bjorn, Yishan, all of you for like letting me do this, because it's always nice to talk about something which I cannot be made to shut up about. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to try out this new, very cool app called so that I can do something like this. And as Yishan said, I was born and raised in Singapore. I spent the first 21 years of my life, did army, all that stuff. But now I'm a strategy professor at UCL. So University College London has a school of management, and I'm like one of the founding faculty there in strategy and entrepreneurship. However, at this very moment in Corona time when everything is shutting down, I'm actually physically located in a very rural part of France in a volcanic region called the Auvergne, which, as Shan says, is also the birthplace of Michelin. And that's actually the view from out of my window. I'm sitting on the deck because it's nice outside. And this is my way of apologizing for what is likely to be at some point later a poor internet connection. So anyway, I'm just gonna move swiftly along. I think my focus in sort of the work that I do, both as a researcher and as a consultant, is in understanding how to design innovation organizations, right? And I'm specifically interested in what role uncertainty plays in innovation work, which is the kind of work that you do when you have to come up with something new, as well as how you design organizations so that you can do innovation work better. And I'm also very interested, obviously, in how that kind of thing makes you more resilient when the world becomes uncertain. And obviously right now, as Shan said, in Corona time, it's like everything around us is uncertain, right? Like business, like the business environment, what is going to happen in the future. We don't even know, like 2 months out, really what's going to be happening. But I got here kind of in a very circuitous way, and it was mostly marked by accidentally falling into particular kinds of work. So, late in 2010, when I was like kind of a grad student in a PhD program, I found myself in this basement kitchen of a restaurant in Washington, D.C. And I was just kind of like trying to not get in the way as kitchen porters and chefs kind of run around doing whatever it is that they do during lunch service. And what I was doing is I was watching and observing a team of R&D chefs come up with a menu of new dishes for a restaurant. And I just want to say that that's kind of the frame for a lot of what I'm going to be talking about later. And I hope what Bjorn and I end up kind of riffing on, it's that the idea is innovation work is sort of the same kind of work no matter what industry you're in, even if the things that you make as a result of innovation work look different. They can look in software like a new app, they can look in hardware like a new phone, or they can look in kitchens like a new dish. Right, so anyway, the owner and head chef of this restaurant is Jose Andres, who you may know because of his philanthropic disaster relief activities with hurricanes and other natural disasters. I'll say a little bit more about that later. But I'd accidentally fallen into this kind of situation because at the time I was doing a PhD on organizational behavior at Harvard, and I was trying to understand like how you create organizations that can be good at innovation. And that's obviously a question which business school people care about quite a bit. I just come from working at Google in California in the product team. I worked on maps and Earth, as well as like some weird things like lunar landers and structured data storage infrastructures. And then after that, as I was telling Bjorn before you all came on, I kind of became very, very stressed out despite working at Google. And I decided to do something completely different, which is to go work in Colorado at a woodworking and art studio called Anderson Ranch. And this is the very beautiful outside space of the Anderson Ranch Art Foundation, which also has studios that you can go into for the summer or for the rest of the year. In any case, the sort of the connection with, I guess, food is because, and this is where the Batsomi comes in, I'm also Singaporean and I'm very interested in food. And I think I kind of always had in the back of my mind when I was doing the research for organizational innovation, it would have been really nice to find a way to do it on organizations that actually interested me because, it's interesting, I guess, in a way to go study how a microchip foundry comes up with new kinds of microchips. But it's much, much more interesting to go to a restaurant and figure out how chefs come up, for instance, with new dishes. So, Jose was kind of doing this lecture at Harvard on the science of cooking. And during this lecture, which I went to, he mentioned how his innovation team, which is called the Think Food Tank, was not only how he's made his restaurants innovative, how he got them to come up with new dishes, but also how he made them really effective. They were very profitable despite being restaurants, and they worked really well as teams of people. So he had office hours the following day, and I went to those office hours, and kind of as a joke, I was never expecting that would happen. I asked him if he would let me come and observe what the Think Food Tank does. for my PhD research. So the bizarre thing is he actually said yes. And he had no reason for saying yes. He had no idea who I was. He had no idea what this would entail, but he was like, yeah, sure, come on over. And so sort of at that point, I was like, okay, I guess I should do it. And that's how I fell into studying this really strange world of high-end, cutting-edge culinary innovation teams that create kind of really bizarre things, right? They make things like food that is enhanced by sound. So this is a dish at the Fat Duck. They find out ways, or actually they discover new things that function as ingredients by learning how to cook with them in ways that people have never done before. So these are 250-year-old clams from northern Norway that have to be cooked in very different ways so that they don't become really rubbery or kind of slimy. They also come up with, for instance, new business models for publishing. So this is obviously Modernist Cuisine. It's a 5-volume cookbook that is probably still the most expensive cookbook in commercial production, and probably the most profitable cookbook ever made. And the guy who came up with this idea and is behind the lab that did it used to be the CTO of Microsoft, Nathan Myhrvold. They also come up with, these teams that I'm working with, they also come up with new ways of thinking about menus and dishes to create narrative, not only at the level of the dish, but also across the arc of an entire meal. And they come up with conferences during which they assemble communities of people that reshape the future. The teams that come up with these new ideas in food sometimes also come up with things like new organizational forms for rapidly deploying teams of people to create food relief in emergency settings. So Jose's nonprofit World Central Kitchen, you can kind of see the logo up there. What they do is they have an organizational structure that allows them to land at any disaster area, like a hurricane or like a volcanic eruption, or actually even like a riot situation. And they can rapidly spin up these, essentially a network of pop-up restaurants that are able to feed tens of thousands of people every day from almost a standing start. So all of these things I think of as innovation in food in various different ways. And these teams are learning how to do this stuff. And what I was doing was actually spending several years actually embedded inside these teams, learning how they did it and trying to figure out what they did so that other industries could figure out from learning from them how to do it as well. So some of the restaurants are, and some of the R&D teams are at the Fat Duck, which you may know because Heston Blumenthal does a lot of TV shows. This is a restaurant which I cannot name, but I call Amaya, which is not actually in South America, even though I say it's there. They're one of the top restaurants in the world for innovation. This is the lab that produced that cookbook and a bunch of other books as well, called the Cooking Lab, which produced Modernist Cuisine. This is Nathan Myhrvold's operation. And then of course there's Jose Andres' restaurants, because other than doing the disaster relief stuff, he also does restaurants, a very profitable range of restaurants around the world. So basically, I don't want to take too much more time with this because Sean said I had 10 minutes, but there were basically 6 main insights that came out of this for me. And I'm happy to talk more about them or not. But the first one is that risk is not the same thing as uncertainty, for sure. And the problem is most people don't understand the difference between the two, and they assume that everything is risk, even though some of it is actually uncertainty as well. The second insight is that confusing risk with uncertainty can be fatal. And we've actually seen that happening in this pandemic. And we also saw it happening before in the lead up to the last major recession in 2008 that was worldwide. The third thing, which is maybe counterintuitive, is that the best way to make an organization resilient to uncertainty as well as innovative is not to avoid uncertainty, but instead to inject it into the organization. And then one of the things that is also true is uncertainty in hiring processes creates more innovative and higher performing teams, not less innovative, lower performing teams. Uncertainty in goal setting, if you inject it the right way, can actually create organizations that can innovate and adapt better than those that are protected from uncertainty. And finally, this one maybe is most interesting for people who are trying to run businesses. It's that even at the level of how you choose to motivate your teams and individuals, if you inject uncertainty into it, it actually makes teams and individuals both more willing to fail and more able to learn. So anyway, there's much more that I can say about all this, but I won't say it now. What I will say is a lot of that is said in the book, which you can pick up in Singapore, actually. I think it's in Kinokuniya. And also I write a newsletter every week where we talk about not knowing and uncertainty in everyday life as well as organizational life. Okay, anyway, so that's enough from me. I'm going to go back away from this thing and turn things back to Shan and Bjorn.
Yeah. Thanks, Vaughn, for that. I mean, it's quite amazing.
Absolutely.
What a trajectory has happened as the result of a breakdown. And I think Bjorn, you have your own version of that as well, in terms of how your experience in a large enterprise has led you to where you are today. So I also just wanted to, I think there's so many threads that we can dive in there on the themes that you've just shared with us. Each one of them is really quite dense. But I kind of wanted to recount one of my favorite moments in your book, which is when there was the MAD conference, right? The food conference started by the people behind Noma. And it sort of rained, or there was some like thunderstorm, and what was meant to be the conference venue that very morning was like totally drenched. And you talked about how the team organized to get the show up and running, right? And I'm thinking that in this age, right, in the post-COVID or live with COVID era, we're gonna have to contend with nature, and organizations are gonna have to find kind of the esprit de corps of like, okay, problem solve on the go, be resourceful. Where do we get hay bales so that our 300 guests from all over the world can convene? It's just that level of kind of immediate problem solving. So I wanted you to kind of kick off with kind of answering the question of what is the key factor behind these teams that can learn as they go, or I mean in the old saying, build the plane as you're flying it, right? What is the distinctive thing that allows them to be able to do that and figure things out? Because I think a lot of us are facing those in our own contexts.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And I would be very curious to hear what Bjorn has to say about it as someone who is, all startups are basically planes being built as they are being flown, right? I mean, from my perspective, I think the main thing I would say is the organization and the people inside it cannot be expecting to know what to be doing in the future, because it's the expectation that you have certainty that prevents you from responding to things as they happen. And also, very importantly, at the individual level, from being willing to do whatever it is that you need to do to make it work, rather than simply what you were expecting to do, right? So I'll sort of illustrate more concretely. If you have 4 people on a team and everyone has a very clearly defined job scope, and they're expecting that the only work that they have to do is what's in their job scope, if something happens that makes the team have to respond in unexpected ways, but no one in the team is willing to do something different, or even able to think about learning how to do something different, you are not going to have the result that you pointed to. And this is a disaster, especially if you're in a startup, right? Like if you're going to pivot and every one of your employees expects to do something which is predefined in advance, part of their bonus assessment criterion, you're not going to be able to pivot. So I think the biggest thing, and this is just the example at the individual level, at the individual and the organizational level, both the individual and the organization that the individual is part of, they cannot be expecting to know what the future is. They have to be at least a little bit expecting that the future is going to be unknown. And the moment you expect it, the moment it's explicit, it's like suddenly you are like thinking about what you could be doing that is better and more appropriate. You're thinking about how the organization can change what it's trying to do to be more effective in the market. That simple change, that's the uncertainty mindset. And that's the thing that is the fundamental kind of baseline, the foundation, on top of which goal setting, hiring, motivation, all that works.
I think that's also just such a great apology for being present. And so I'm going to ask you, Bjorn, to chime in and then also maybe share a bit of context about your journey to...
To uncertainty. Yeah. So thank you to everyone for having me here, like Project Feed, Straits Plan as well. I kind of miss my standard, like thank yous. And just to maybe, shed a bit of light on my journey to uncertainty, or my current career in startups. So just to give a bit of a background, I'm on my 3rd startup right now. And prior to this, I would say that the very first day I took on this path was in Singapore. I was in high school. I saw a barefooted Mark Andreessen on the cover of Time magazine in 1998 or 1999, right? So I think I give my age away to everyone. So I was enamored with how someone that young, I think he was 21 at the point of time, was running a company worth billions and actually appearing on Time magazine, because I was used to seeing like people triple his age, you know, like on Time magazine. And so I got curious, and I would say that about 5 years later, in 2004, 2005, I foolishly walked into the embers, or I wouldn't even say embers of the fire. I mean, like, oh well, there was a fire. There was a dot-com crash, and I started my tech career in Silicon Valley. I actually started my career in startups, working on the production floor of a hardware startup. It was blue collar. It was literally a blue collar job because I was wearing a blue coat every day, putting together hard disk drives to send up to space. There was this company that sold hard disk drives, and they were testing it in the upper atmosphere. And NASA was one of their clients, so was Boeing, and so on. That taught me that innovation was messy. It's not what you see, right? It's definitely not what you see on the papers. It's definitely not what you, I mean, like Trump made it famous by fake news, you know, like you got to see the underbelly. And where else to see the underbelly of innovation than to go to the mecca of technology and see these scrappy startups, you know, trying to do that. I left that company because I was not used to being in a logistics role, and my next role exposed me to a sales job in a biotech startup, where I actually learned how biotech startups innovated in a very different way around the constraints of government regulations, FDA, and so on, right? So that was a very different situation. And then finally, I decided that, well, hardware was not for me and biotech was not for me, and hence I'm stuck being a software entrepreneur right now. So that's a bit of context. And so I would say that, you know, the key thing to learning about, to adapting, because we're all on a journey of adaptation right now to uncertainty, whether in our lives or in any organization, large or small, is improvisation, right? And if I may use a movie analogy, I think whenever I think improvisation, I think Apollo 13, right? There was this movie, great movie. I think Apollo 13, you know, like eponymous number 13, reflected very torturous and nearly fatal process where I think they were running out of oxygen. There was a dent in the machine. There was a hole, and it needed to survive, right? I think having that kind of survival instinct, learning to develop that kind of survival instinct, learning to deal with, am I supposed to say, am I allowed to say the S word, shit, as it happens? Too bad I said it already. Right, was really crucial. We need to learn how to process our initial shock and having our lifestyles, our mindsets, our normal trains of thought being disrupted. And then, you know, like get down to business and really figure out how to solve the problem at hand right in front of us, because there's simply no time sometimes to worry about the past or the future. And this is how I work in the part about staying present, right? Because sometimes we just need to we just need to allow that shock to come and wash past us. And then, you know, like focus ourselves on the immediacy of the problem in front of us, whether it being a catastrophic loss in sales, whether it being a big sales shock in a month, a week, a quarter, and then learning how to pivot the business model, learning to adapt. I think there's a lot of Singaporeans in this Zoom call over here. One thing I'm looking at is Zook, right? Zook is pretty much the icon of Singapore, and they have had to make some very tough decisions to pivot away from partying and clubbing to cuisine, right? To learning about what makes a new party in today's pandemic world. So I think improvisation is really key, and learning how to deal with that initial shock to our system is key.
Also dating yourself there, by the way. So I'll take, I'll just rattle on for about 2-3 more questions, but you guys should chime in terms of in the chat for questions that you'd like to add. So bringing a personal lens into the conversation, you each took a kind of an off the beaten path insofar as, you know, when I look at my peers in Singapore, and, you know, from corporate employment to something a little bit more dynamic. And I was wondering what, for you, was the decider in terms of taking on this level of uncertainty. I think earlier on in the conversation, in the warm-up, we were talking about Vaughn kind of not being a company man, right? So yeah, what drove you guys to do this, and would you recommend it?
Vaughn, will go first, or? Okay. I have been in startups for far longer than I've been in big companies. So I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer this, because when I started my career in Silicon Valley working at those hardware and biotech startups, and it took me, the only big companies I've worked in is Ogilvy, which is an ad agency and advertising agency, and Zendesk, right? Advertising agencies are big, huge. I was young, I was 23, and I, didn't know better, and I thought that, you know what, I'm young, so, I should just, wing it, and try to strike it out on my own. So for me, it's kind of the opposite. After I joined a large organization, I realized that I wasn't used to being a specialist. I wanted to really stretch my wings out a little bit and know where I am actually bad at. And so I decided to be more of a generalist and become an entrepreneur. I wouldn't say that I have a very methodical, structured thought process to say that, I should go there. It was really part of my early, it was really my time in college that exposed me in Silicon Valley. After I graduate, I think I should try to, be a Mark Andreessen, and so I actually joined a large organization, and I feel like I wanted to go back to uncertainty, because I felt that I seem to thrive better with uncertainty, and I don't know whether it is a good thing, So that's my honest answer to that question.
And have a monk-like life, which
Ascetic.
Ascetic, yeah.
I think I have the same kind of ish response. Like, the only time I have ever worked in a big corporation is for the 3 and a bit years that I worked at Google, right? So it's not really that I realized it. I think maybe an accurate way to say it is, while I was working at my first big corporation, I realized that there are many things about it, like even down to the level of like physiology, where you realize you wake up every morning and there is like a low level of stress that you don't let yourself admit. But when you measure things like heart rate, blood pressure, you know that you are stressed out, right? And you know that you get ill more often, you know that you're not generally baseline happy. And I think what happened eventually was I read a couple of books that kind of highlighted for me things I was not willing to admit to myself. I talked to some people who highlighted for me things I was not willing to admit to myself. And then after that, there's no option. It's like, you cannot go back to something which is instinctively and viscerally just wrong, right? So that's kind of what happened, I guess. Yeah.
The differences in your heart rate pre and post.
Dramatic differences.
So I want to go to the first point that you made, which is there's a difference between risk and uncertainty. Can you unpack that for us a little bit more? What does it mean, and why does it matter? And what does it look like outside of a restaurant context?
For sure. I would love to do that, because I think it's, so my personal hobby horse, right, is that nobody understands the difference between the two well enough, and they don't act on it enough. So the main difference is, technically, risk is a very, very limited subset of not knowing what the future will hold, right? Risk only applies when you don't know exactly what is going to happen, but you know all the possible outcomes and how probable each one is. Because like this idea of like expected utility or expected outcomes, the only way you can expect and calculate the probabilities and choose the right action is if you know all the possible things that could happen and how likely each one is. Now, most of the time, and so when I describe it like that, what I'm now saying is that true uncertainty is all the rest. When you don't know what the future will be, and you don't even know what the possible outcomes are, that's true uncertainty. When you maybe know what all the possible outcomes are, but you don't know how likely each one will be, that's true uncertainty. And then there's a third more important thing, I guess, is even when you know all the possible outcomes and how likely they are. If you don't know how much you want each one of those outcomes, you're also in a situation of true uncertainty, right? So true uncertainty basically is a situation where you don't know what the future will hold, and you don't know one or more of the following things: all the possible outcomes, how likely each of the possible outcomes is, and how much you want the outcomes so that you can aim for the right thing. And so what does it look like outside of cuisine? I mean, we are surrounded by it now. Like if you run a business, or even if you don't run a business, like what will there be a lockdown in, France, will there be a lockdown in France in the next 2 months? That will affect how you invest in people, how you invest in, I don't know, real estate or stock or everything like that. Right now, nobody knows, right? In Singapore, if you're in any kind of hospitality, retail, tourism industry in Singapore, do you know whether there will be tourists the way there were tourists even last year at the same time in 2 months, 1 month, 3 months, 6 months? No, you don't. You are in a situation of true uncertainty. Back in 2008, just to give one last example, all of the people who made these derivative financial instruments out of repackaging and transforming all of these assets, if you don't know how things interact with each other to affect how they perform, you are also in a situation of true uncertainty. So I think the distinction is very, very, very generally applicable. And right now, we are in a world which is dominated by true uncertainty, not by risk. And everyone is still thinking about it as risk. And that's really annoying. And also it's dangerous as well. Because if you make decisions based on an assumption that the situation is risky and the situation is actually uncertain, then you do things like, oh, let's optimize when we lock down. And then you look at what's going on in the US, or actually what happened in the UK. Or let's optimize and save all the banks that are too big to fail, because that seems to be the only clear risk that you can mitigate. What happens after that? Massive global inflation because of massive money supply for the last decade and a bit. So I think I'll stop there, but that's the difference in my mind, and the reason why it's important, because it's everywhere. Right? All of the actions that we take now need to be informed by the difference between risk and uncertainty and a clear understanding of how they're different, because if not, we make the wrong decisions.
I think also that there's some upside to this uncertainty, right? I mean, an earlier point you made around the teams that take it for a given that you don't know what's going to happen next. I think that's also a forcing function for just or motivation and condition for just being really entrepreneurial, right? And making and then kind of applying your intent towards the thing that you want to do, and then ergo, startup world or creating product. I want to talk about geography for a bit, because I think there's also potential upsides to this pandemic. And beyond, I mean, I've literally run into you at Starbucks, managing your remote teams from your MacBook, which we are using for this very conference.
It's a new MacBook, yes.
I won't spill my drink on it. And I think many years ago, Vaughn, you told me how you wanted to be geographically irrelevant. I think today we can plant the flag in the middle of, I don't know, Straits Clan or your neck of the woods right here, to say that, I mean, we sort of achieved that. And right now, there are all sorts of possibilities that are going to happen with remote or distributed work, right? So, I mean, does the post-COVID world make this more or less possible, you think, like geographical relevance, right?
I can say something, but I'm actually very, very curious what Bjorn has to say about it, because this is a question that a lot of the people that I'm interested in are very interested in. So I don't know. I want to hear from Bjorn first.
All right. How futuristic do you want to get?
Go. This is a future of work question, right?
I think somebody wrote me recently, I think yesterday, and I try to quote him like verbatim. What everybody thought would take decades happened in months. Nobody thought that digital transformation was going to happen pretty much over a month. But like how many companies has gone through flexible, working hours, flexible locations, work from home, work-life balance, family-friendly work environment, because you're now working from home, right? And having said that, I'm also very sensitive to the fact that there are some people in this Zoom that may be struggling to deal with it just because of different situations. So my heart goes out to them as well. And having said that, the thing here is that we are accelerating the way that we think about work, right? The way that we redefine work, because I think we've been hanging on to the industrial age definition of what work really means. That you got to clock in, clock out, fixed hours, fixed locations, and we've been making incremental moves towards trying to stretch that. You have some companies who are really trying to push the boundaries, right? For example, one of them namely is Google, right? A lot of tech firms, they really try to stretch the boundaries of what work really means, right? A lot of startups, not just in Silicon Valley, but around the world as well. But by and large, I think we look at more traditional industries like the public service, for example, right? Like the education, healthcare, for example, there's a lot of rethinking. If you're in the healthcare sector, you're thinking about, well, do I need my admin workers coming back to the office anymore, right? You're thinking, well, let's make them go work from home. And then in Singapore, you got to deal with the situation of the internet separation, right? So how do you manage that, right? In software firms, and I'm sure Vaughn knows a lot about this as well, we think a lot about information security, right? How do you manage information security when you suddenly have to deal with people working from home, where their spouses, their partners, their roommates may just be walking by your laptop, and the organization is not able to provision enough laptops in like a week's time to everyone. And it goes back to my point about improvisation. I think coming back to the point of geography as well, it's a new frontier, right? It's unexplored. I cannot wait to see what change will be effected, as a result of this situation. We are 6 months in to this right now, and I hope that it ends soon. But also, I think we have to be prepared mentally for the eventuality that this may last longer. And I'm reading a lot of papers as well and reports from your employer, McKinsey, about the various situations, plan A, plan B, and plan C on how we can deal with this so that, we can calculate the risks, right? And kind of manage around it rather than be trying to run away from the risk. So I think, I think geography is something, it's interesting, but geography has almost become a new challenge to businesses now because we have never had to deal with it, and now we have to. Yeah. Now I'm very curious what you have to say, Vaughn.
No, totally. I think, by the way, I agree completely with what you said, Bjorn, because I'll talk about the opportunity next, but I think the big kind of challenge or liability now is that it's obviously great if you can work like a lot of us can remotely because we do like so-called knowledge work, or we do work where we are geographically relevant. But if you need to do work that is not geographically relevant, you are actually, let's say you are a dentist, you cannot remotely fill a cavity. If you are like a sanitation worker, you cannot remotely sanitize, like you can't take out the trash remotely, right? So there is like a big and growing separation because a lot of the work that is necessarily not geographically relevant is also work that tends to be undervalued, underpaid. So I think this is going to be a big problem, but not one that we can solve now. I think in terms of opportunity, there is actually massive opportunity in terms of, to what Bjorn was saying before, kind of getting rid of a lot of the leftovers of the industrial, like of the pre-corona time of thinking about knowledge work as having to be co-located, of having like FaceTime and all this other bullshit. All that now can go away. And then what you have to do is you have to solve some of the problems like data security. You have to solve, in one case, I think, regulatory security if you're processing data across jurisdictions. And I think there's a big question also about, things like labor law. Wow, okay, this is interesting. There is now smoke. So there is a question about labor law and what happens to, are you meant to be covered by the law of one country that you happen to be physically located in if you work for a company that is located in a different country, right? So those questions are big question mark. But I think the big opportunity is now, you used to be stuck in the country that you were living in if you were a knowledge worker and you were unable to go work. Let's say you are in Serbia it would be hard for you to go work for a company in America because they wanted you to be physically located there. Now, who cares, right? So there could be that. I think there is that advantage to it. And this idea of geographical irrelevance, I kind of want to believe that if we start thinking about that as a desirable thing, then we can start to rearrange or reorganize how work happens around the fact that we don't need people to be physically located. We can find ways that we can learn how to be with people, learn how to get to know teammates and coworkers without having to be physically located with them for a long time. Anyway, yeah, so those are my thoughts at the moment.
Yeah, well,
before I think I'll just kick off the floor and Dom has a question, but I think to kind of round that up, that bit up, right? One of the what I'm seeing from this conversation is that if we're lucky, right, across swaths of industries or sectors, we'll see more self-organizing teams, right, that are nimble, able to put out product, maybe even small batches, or kind of research or like craft-driven work, even as production becomes local, right? And hopefully that will lead to kind of, yeah, like some delight and color in the landscape as well. So thanks very much for that. And we're not seeing many of we were gesticulating to try and see everybody in the room right now. But it would be great to just, like, if you have questions, just chime in and Dom's going to kick us off.
yeah, well, thanks for sharing. So actually, on what you just said, I kind of wanted to challenge you a little bit there. So when I read your book, actually one of the takeaways that I got was that the process of innovation seemed very much face to face, right? You talked about the process in that book where there's a lot of interaction, consulting with others, making micro adjustments, understanding what people were like. That seemed like a very integral part of the innovation process. So actually, my takeaway from reading a book was that innovation is not geographically agnostic. Actually, it's very positive if people are kind of in the same location. So, when you think about how people are working now, how do you think that will sort of impact innovation over a longer period of time?
I think it's a really great question. And again, I'm very curious what Bjorn has to say in response to that question as well. So I would say that it's true that if you are learning how to cook something or figuring out how to cook something together, it is not impossible, but it's also probably easier if you are like physically co-located with each other. But a lot of the things that I think make innovation teams more effective at innovating are not necessarily physically embodied, right? So to use a term, I like that term a lot, by the way, geographically agnostic. I think a lot of the things that allow people to do micro tests to validate what capabilities they have, to interact with each other in real time so that they have ongoing low-level interaction that builds understanding that at a very deep and high-dimensional level. A lot of those things are not necessarily geographically bound together. So, and the interesting thing about Corona time is that as teams go instantly online and virtual, you're seeing lots of tools that are forming. Either they're being repurposed from before, or they're being built brand new in order to help people do some of these things. So I'll just give one example, which is, you used to be able to sort of just like stand up and look over the cubes and talk to someone on the other desk over there. And now you can't do that anymore. But there are now these, not now, I think they've existed in some form or another for like some years now, but there are apps where you can have an always on audio bridge where your ability to hear someone is determined by the proximity of your avatar in this app. So you're simulating sort of the experience of being able to just like knock on someone's door or stand up and reach over and like grab someone without having to physically be located in the same space. And so I agree that it's obviously not going to be possible to like completely replicate the experience of being in the same space as someone else. But at the same time, many of the things that were possible in that setting can be replicated outside of that setting. And I think one of the things that is really interesting about now is that now that the need is there and it's universal, we will see that people build tools for it. And those will become new industries of their own. They will become companies that are worth some money, which is great. This is what innovation is all about. Responding to new needs as they become more obvious. Bjorn, your thoughts?
No, I was just Googling this word to make sure I got it right. I mean, like humans have a tendency to anthropomorphize. I mean, I'm pretty sure I still got it wrong. Technology, and to your point as well, Vaughn, I mean, like, I think you hit the right notes as well, is that we try to build technology, even we always try to build technology to suit what we are used to, right? In some way, it's inescapable that we cannot escape our DNA, our caveman DNA. The way we communicate is very tactile, right? Very visceral. And I think when we invent new tools in this, as you aptly put it, corona time, more and more technologies will try to emulate what we do when we actually, like metaphorically get out of that cubicle, right? To nudge, to knock. And drawing from my own experience as well, over the past 6 months, is that I have to be honest, I struggle. For me, something that is not geographically agnostic is actually working with my product team, my designer. There is nothing that I can find that replaces really walking up to a whiteboard, gesticulating and using, and making really ugly stickman drawings on the whiteboard in order to communicate a point, right? It's and one thing I do for my team a lot is to encourage everyone that they should turn on video, because and even if and bandwidth is a big concern over here, right? Because as much as possible, I want to see their faces. I want to see like at least the upper half of their body, because there's so much communication that is being lost when you only have audio, right? There's a very high tendency to mistake somebody's tone, somebody perceive passivity in terms of not speaking up as being non-communicative, as being disconsenting, disagreeing, right? Because a simple thing like what Shan is doing right next to me is that, or what Vaughn is doing right now is nodding his head, right? And so, like sometimes you want to also pay attention to what other people do as well, sometimes they furrow the eyebrows, or they're like tilting their head a little bit, and you need these cues in order to work. Be it, drafting up numbers for the next quarter, writing code, sorting out a project coordination issue, planning an event. There is so much that, we may be losing out as well. So try as much as possible as well. I think, I mean, we are trying to adapt to the medium, right, with video. And so one thing we do is that we turn on video over Zoom as much as possible. Earphones and headphones must be doing a roaring business as well, because these days, I think the quality of your talent or the quality of your output of your work is highly correlated, or maybe even there's a high causation effect as well with the quality of your audio, right? If you're able to communicate the nuances, your pauses, people know that you actually meant to pause and mean to pause, rather than that was a internet enforced pause. I think this is what makes us human. And I think new technologies or even existing technology that needs to move forward after this time has to grow and take into these type of very humane nuances.
It's the creation of ambience, right? And picking up human context. And it's been amazing how much we were able to do that here as well, kind of leaning into our existing and past relationships, right? But this new world can be very exhausting, right? And it's been said that the reason that Zoom hangouts are exhausting because your brain is actually trying to compensate for that loss of that lossiness, right, of the format. And so our evolutionary, like it's almost like we have to evolve, and companies and solutions will have to evolve to supply that offset the loss of ambience. But I also wanted to talk about kind of your personal practice, and also we're still looking out for questions. Do raise your hand if we've missed you and haven't quite gotten any of your questions in the chat yet. But yeah, so 2 years ago, I think it was the World Health Organization made burnout an actual real mental, I mean a health concern, right? And I'm sure that the take up of meditation apps has gone up as well. But speaking from your own personal practice, how do you guys, especially in these tiring days, prime yourself for health, wellness, your well-being, and therefore continue to do your best work, right? Or do some work, right? And continuing to innovate, whether your product or your lives. What are you guys doing to keep yourselves vital?
You want to go first, Vaughn?
Yeah.
Okay, I can
You
go
know what
first.
I'm doing,
Yeah.
yeah.
All right. I think one word, holidays. I mean, you know, like we can't travel, right? We are stuck on a very small island. And so one thing I've really focused on this year is to truly take a break. And when I say take a break, I really try to go on I would say a 90% or 95% digital detox, where I really get out of my, I really get off my phone, right? So I took a week off. I made arrangements to make sure that I farm out as much of my work to my fellow management team members as well. My girlfriend's on this Zoom as well, and she would know that, you know, like we went out, we played board games, you know, like they were actual physical board games, we actually went out to nature, we did runs, we did hikes, just so that we could try to really get away from work, because work is digital. We may choose to deny it, but you know, every time I think, I'm just going to like steal some words from Vaughn as well. Every time we look at the laptop, our mind subconsciously pretty much generates a low level of stress. It's additional to where we are just kind of looking away at this like maybe nice wooden oak wall over here, right? So I think it's very important for me, and I encourage that of my team members as well, to really try to, you know, like gazette time away from the laptop. You know, I don't expect you to be checking your phones, you know, like after a certain hour, right? And if things are really important, we'll call you. But you know, don't think that you need to respond really fast. I think like trying to find the equivalent of the analog version of the non-traveling version of a holiday, I think for me is actually really important. Other than, you know, my usual routine where I usually meditate on my commute. So it's a 20-minute ride, and I meditate during that time. And I try to keep up this routine in the middle of the day around 3 to 4 p.m. or maybe doing some exercise. I try to just, you know, take a walk. I never actually, you know, like one thing I realize I do is that I never get food delivered to me. I walk to get my food because especially during the lockdown, the circuit breaker in Singapore is like, that was so precious. That was one of the few freedoms that was afforded to us by the government, which was I walk, I climb the stairs, I go get my food, because I think that at least gets me from say 500 daily steps to maybe 3,000. So that was some of the things that I did. Yeah.
Vaughn, personal practice?
Personal practice, yes. Yeah, I agree that I think the first thing, which I completely agree with Bjorn, is taking breaks that are real breaks, right? So I guess it's easier so the job that I have most of the year, I'm not like in a timetable as much as if I was working a 9-to-5 job. So I'm very lucky in that regard. But I think also in some ways, especially if you're maybe running your own business or you're in some kind of like self-directed work, it's even more important to be able to say to yourself, like, my self-directed work will stop at this point, and part of it will be making arrangements so that the work that you would normally do is picked up by someone else. And then after that, really creating the context and stacking the deck so that you don't get tempted to go back into work while you're out of it. And that may involve things like intentionally leaving the phone behind somewhere else, not bringing a laptop to a break location, and things like that. So I very fortunately have learned how to do this really well over the last few years. And I tend to do that. I also agree with Bjorn about not getting food delivered. I actually have never gotten food delivered in London when I was living there. And I probably will not be able to do it here because I am in a town of, I think, 8 people. I cook most meals myself.
You're gonna gather berries later?
Yeah, no. Gather berries, pick mushrooms, all this stuff. It's a different way of thinking about it. But I usually just like I go buy raw ingredients, I cook it myself because I have time to do that, which is, I'm very lucky. But that's a big part of it as well, because it forces you to take a chunk of time out, right? It's like an hour if you must, just so that you can eat. And in a way, that's sort of what you can do to make it necessary to take a break from doing work. And then the third thing, I guess, is we were all, everyone on this call probably in a country where there was a lockdown. So what do you do in a lockdown to like go somewhere else? I mean, the classic thing is to read, right? Like this is the easiest, cheapest way that you can go somewhere else, be in someone else's head for as long or as short a time as you want. So I do that all the time. I do it before I go to bed. I do it sometimes in the morning. And the other last thing, I guess, about personal practice is, especially during lockdown, like social media became very, very important because that's how I was communicating with people and all that. But it's super important to not get, I mean, for me anyway, to not rabbit hole on Twitter because, you know, like doom scrolling, I was definitely doom scrolling, gotta stop. So no doom scrolling about the bad news coming up from the US or from like Europe or like the UK, no like getting rabbit holed into Instagram stories about other people's beautiful lives, which are probably all false. All those things are important things to make sure that you know are happening and then intentionally stop doing. Anyway, that's me.
Off the mast or move from urban London to rolling hills in France. We have questions. And then I think we can wrap on if people don't have other questions to add. But essentially, I think what we have here from Ife and Emma are kind of embracing uncertainty and fostering innovation questions. These speak to the part of me that loves large incumbent laggard bureaucracies. So Ife's question is, how do organizations guide or persuade the people to embrace uncertainty when they're so used to it, right? It's a drug. It's hard to just do it by fiat. Is it more like enacting uncertainty principles in aspects of work without calling it, so that people learn by doing? You know? So how would you? What advice would you have for Ife, who is well, Ife I think works in the public sector, right? If I'm not wrong. Yeah. So yeah, what would you do to kind of encourage this without doing it head on?
Yeah, so I can say something really quick, and then again, I'm very curious about the practicalities of what Bjorn is probably doing. So what Ife said, incepting principles in aspects of work without calling it that is exactly right. So what I would probably say is, if you want to create, what you want to do is you want to create the conditions under which the way people work is more likely to embrace uncertainty, even if you never call it that. So I'll give just one example, and the others, I mean, if you want, you can go read the book. But one example is, if you want to make, for instance, an employee's role a little bit more uncertain so that they are forced to learn something new, define their jobs a little bit more, all you need to do is make that a part of how you hire people and how you define their job role, right? So if you are a large organization, the normal way that you hire people is you write a full job description, you put it out in the newspaper, people apply, you filter for people who best fit what you think you need, and then this is how they get hired, and this is also how they get evaluated. This takes away all the uncertainty from a job role completely. Even though in reality, anyone who's ever worked in a big organization knows that a large part of your job is not covered by your job scope, right? But this is what the organization tells you your job is about. This is how you get rewarded. This is how you get rewarded more. If instead you want to inject uncertainty into it, you don't have to call it, here's my uncertainty job role. All you do is you say something like, 75% of your job is this. You got to do it. 25% of your job, we don't know. You tell us. That's one example. And you can make that part of the hiring process or not. If you want to make it part of the hiring process, you can say, okay, you've got a 1-month trial period during which you show us what that 25% will be. And at the end of it, it becomes part of how you get evaluated if you want to do it that way. And there's ways you can inject uncertainty without calling it that into hiring, into how you set goals at the organizational level as well as in how you motivate people and your teams to do things. So absolutely, just to like headline the thing, don't call it uncertainty. Don't call it all this other stuff that's like very easy to capture. Just do the thing, right? And when you do the thing, it means changing work processes, how you set goals, how you hire people, how you motivate. In fact, even how you design products. All of these things can be inflected by or infused with uncertainty in ways that are productive, not unproductive, because uncertainty can also be bad, but you don't have to make it bad. I'm gonna turn off.
related to Emma's question, actually, which is quite similar actually, which is diving deep on what the right incentives, enabling structures, the support systems, etc. Like what are things to do, right? So maybe just the practicality, but yeah, examples.
Okay. I'll answer Yifei's question first. I think it's almost 2 decades since I left the Singapore Army, where I think Vaughn and I have similarly fond memories of us, like digging around in the mud and running around, rummaging in the forest, doing God knows what. But there's one line that sticks with me after so many years in the corporate, in the business real world, right? Which is, we lead by example. Leadership by example. Don't do something that you yourself, don't tell someone to do something you wouldn't do yourself, right? If you want a pantry clean up, be prepared to do it and show that you are an example, right? So I think organizations, no matter how big or small, one thing organization can do to guide / motivate, persuade our people is number one, encourage your leaders to show their vulnerabilities. Share concrete examples. How did you deal with uncertainty during this pandemic? Be vulnerable, be real, be authentic. Don't just say, you know what, everybody should embrace uncertainty and then, you don't offer any personal stories of yourself, right? If they actually say that, challenge them during a town hall, right? Write anonymous feedback if you like as well. But I think in organizations, what employees benefit a lot from is to know that they have tacit or explicit approval from the top. That's one, right? That's one, top down. The second point.
Can I say one thing just on what Bjorn just said? A big part of that is talking in public about failure that the leader has actually experienced personally and been responsible for, right?
Yes.
Because this is a really, really big part of it. Like leading by example, a big part of injecting uncertainty to things is to show that a big part of uncertainty, by the way, is failing so that you learn. So if you as a leader are able to talk about how you have failed, and if as a leader you encourage your managers and leaders to talk about how they have failed and what they have learned from failing, that's a huge part of making this change. Okay, sorry, Bjorn, back to you.
Oh, no, like perfectly, perfectly on point as well. I really agree with that too. I think that's the key thing. And to that point, before I move on to my second point, is that because leaders need to demonstrate compassion during this time, right? By being authentic, sharing your vulnerability, I think that's very inspiring, for the rank and file and for their fellow management team members as well. The second is that people don't leave companies, people leave managers, right? So whether you are actually a manager in name, in title, or you are just the team lead, right? And you take up some initiative, I think every one of us have something to do by saying that, you know what, I think we need to demonstrate and lead by example ourselves. Even if our leaders don't feel brave enough to step out to share their vulnerability, we can do so as well, right? So the thing here is that we should be transparent. If there's something in your job that you do not know how to do, perhaps, as a manager, what we can do is to share with our team members and say, you know what, I don't know how to do this. I invite feedback, right? No feedback? Well, these are my 2 best or worst ideas, A and B, right? Tell me, because sometimes when you share A and B and you show people how the sausage is being made, it really encourages people to really, pull up their bootstraps and say, you know what, I think we've got to literally pull up our, shirt sleeves and think about how we can do this by ourselves. Because I think that is learning by doing, right? But they need that kind of, they need to know that their manager or their team member is in the trenches with them. And it starts from the little things. Being there to co-host a Zoom meeting 5 minutes before your colleague comes on board. Maybe they're dealing with an emergency at home, the plumbing broke or something. Being able to do little things like that, I think really leads by example and helps them to learn, to show that, I'm dealing with uncertainty in my own haphazard way. I'm real like you, but I try to do my best, and I can only hope that you will learn from my example, or you will show us your own example as well, because we are learning from one another.
Just quickly on what Bjorn just said, a big part of enabling and giving permission to teams to try new things is simply a leader saying, I want this done, but I don't know how to do it. right? And then I want you to help me figure it out, because that's actually, like, if we really think about what good leadership is, it's not that good leaders always know how to do everything. In fact, the best leaders are the ones who know how to find the people who know how to do the things that they don't know how to do and give them permission to do that. And the best way to give permission is to say, I don't know, but you do. Maybe you help me figure it out.
In Zendesk, there was something really fun, and it was organic, which is what makes it even more beautiful. The designers have Creative Fridays, and we are a software company, and so the Creative Fridays doesn't mean that, you know, like they try to trick the head of design, tries to trick their junior designers and say, you know what, we have this. Let's try to think of this imaginary feature. It's not part of our product, but, you know, like, let's use this excuse to create and do more work. No, they ask them to build paper airplanes. They ask them to build terrarium. They ask them to use Lego to build like random words that you pick out from a box and so on. Because, you know, like creativity, innovation is non-linear and it comes from everywhere. It's very multidisciplinary, right? I think that's one of the slides, I think, or one of the conversations we had earlier as well. I think one thing is really just, you know, like there's so much we could do if we did dedicate like, you know, like just a couple of hours, right? And so back in Zendesk, we dedicated Friday mornings where the designers came out with a creative activity and only the 5 of them did it. And gradually they invited the rest of the company to join in too, right? And so then it became, they put the onus and responsibility on the managers to see whether they would want to encourage their staff, their team members to join these Creative Fridays. And when you do something that is outside of your job scope, I think you really start seeing people come up with new ideas that normally wouldn't voice out, right? It gives that implicit permission for them to speak up. And I think that is one thing that I personally found in my own experience that was very useful. One thing that I also have seen, and my friend Cheryl actually was sitting outside, and she leads a department at the LKY School of Public Policy. And I don't know whether she's listening to this. She may not be happy with me saying this, but she's a Lego instructor for work. And so what she does is that you know, I mean, like childhood memories, right? So she uses Lego as a canvas to get senior leaders to think about using their hands to articulate problems they face. And so that was fascinating because it was really trying to use a new medium to repurpose abstract thoughts, business language that you wouldn't normally find a physical analogy for, right? But with like limited sets of bricks that you have on hand, how would you communicate the point that the positioning, the strategic positioning of your company in market, sub-market A is wrong? How would you do that, right? Maybe you have to, you know, like build a duck, you know, that's walking into a restaurant and say that is wrong and maybe show like rainy weather. I don't know, right? But the thing here is that it provokes conversation and leads them to like new areas that our synapses just have never computed before. And I think that's one really good way, right? Lego for work, right? Check out Cheryl's work at LKY SPP. But, you know, like ask her. I'm not in public policy, she is. And I'm sorry, Cheryl, if you hear this. You started getting a lot of demand for your course. Thanks, Straits Clan.
Yeah. But that's, yeah, talk about making problems plastic, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, any other questions? Feel free to unmute yourself and jump in.
Yeah, I have one thought actually about policymakers and especially incentives, right? And I think it's that actually it's not about putting the right incentives in place, it's about taking away the wrong incentives. So there's two things that most policy and organizations and actually people do. The first one is that they kind of over-valorize success, right? So you always make a big deal of things that are successful. And what that does is it encourages people to think that only success is valuable, not failure. So the first really important thing, if you're a policymaker, is you should make sure that if you are creating a system of incentives, whether it's a tax break or it's like a hierarchy in an organization or who you choose to put on the front page of a newspaper or anything, don't only do nice things for people who are successful. In fact, do fewer nice things for the successful people than you normally would. That's the first policy guidance. The second policy guidance is even weirder because I think what happens is policymakers, institutions, governments, people all overemphasize the importance of being efficient. And actually what that does is it reduces the ability to innovate, because innovation always requires inefficient failure along the way to coming up with something new. There is no innovation organization that can be thought of as being efficient anywhere in the entire world that is actually good at innovating. Because in order to innovate, you must always, always, always fail to get there. And when you fail, you're just not efficient, right? So if your policy making emphasizes being the most efficient, doing the most with the least, you are always going to be squeezing innovation out no matter what you do otherwise. So those two things, don't overvalorize success, don't overvalorize efficiency, are the two things to not do. And then the rest of it will take care of itself, in my opinion.
Less is more. We've got a question from Jenny. What do you think is the most significant piece that the corporate world can learn from the food industry? This is for you, Vaughn. But also,
Ooh, okay. The most significant piece that the corporate world can learn from the food industry, I guess there's one thing, right? And I guess this is sort of like a meta learning. The food industry, especially at the high end, the cutting edge, and for a long time, at least for like the last 15 years or so, it's been very, very clear. It's been undeniably clear that nobody in the cutting edge food world knows what is coming down the line. It's just very sort of uncertain. There was no way they could kind of pretend to themselves, oh, maybe we can predict what's going to happen in the next year or anything like that. They just have to admit to themselves that they don't know what's going to happen next. And so they change the way they do business as a result. That's how I managed to write a book about it, because I could go look at what they were doing and see that they don't pretend, or they aren't self-deluded into thinking that the world is knowable. They simply admit that it isn't. And that's how they become innovative, right? Because I think this goes to an early question. If you are not expecting the world to be knowable, you don't expect the world to be knowable, and you take actions that allow you to learn, to fail, and therefore to come up with new ideas and be innovative. Now, the interesting thing, and the connection to Jenny's question, is I think the corporate world is really, really, really good at deluding itself that it knows what the future will be, right? So any organization that engages in a thorough process of cost-benefit analysis in order to decide on strategy is doing this. And every single organization I've ever heard of, been part of, or worked for, or consulted for, has always, no matter whether or not they say they're uncertainty preferring or whatever, they always end up thinking about things in a cost-benefit way. So the most significant thing that the corporate world can learn from the food industry is, admit when the future is not knowable, and then change the way you work as a result. That's it.
Can put it on the balance sheet.
Yeah, I can say something. I spent 1 month in New Zealand working on 2 different farms, and I learned about new words like freeganism. Freegan, what is a freegan? And through freeganism, I learned that, and I think Vaughn probably know, there's a lot of food wastage in the food industry, right? For every processed food, canned food that we buy, fresh meat that we buy, or vegetables that we buy, there's a lot more that's being thrown away, right? Living on farms actually taught me that, there's a lot that we don't see. Similarly, in the corporate world as well, I think there's a lot of corporate wastage. When you actually put every single activity into a cost-benefit analysis, I think there is a lot that cannot be enumerated. So what can we do, in order to actually use that? What can we do? I don't have the answers. Like, what can organizations do in order to actually make employees, feel more engaged in their daily work, not just by driving their working hours towards generating profit for the company, but maybe in other areas as well. What can you do in terms of sustainability, right? Every public company right now has to articulate what their sustainability strategy is, and many times I think there's a lot of talk and not enough walking on those papers that are filed by the big 3-4 accounting firms. So I think one challenge that we can do going forward is that let's not forget what the biggest topic of last year was before the pandemic hit, which was sustainability, right? Emissions, how do we make the environment, way more important. I think we should not think about, well, during this pandemic, how can we generate more profit and get back to the normal? The normal is not sustainable. I think we need to think as well about what is outside of the purview of our balance sheets in an organization, so that we can actually rethink, redefine how an organization can deliver more value to society other than profits in the stock markets.
Cool. Just reeling from that. Vaughn, anything to add? I guess I'll go to Sam's question, right? Which I think was sparked
Cool.
culture wars. Hey Sam, Vaughn, do you think innovation in the Chinese food world is deeply different from the Western slash Japanese slash Peruvian? I don't know what that vector is actually.
Yeah.
Oh, my
Yeah.
I want to go to that.
yeah.
It seems
Yeah.
Chinese, and also Sam, I have been watching a YouTube series called Chinese Cooking Simplified, as if it's really great, by the way. You guys should watch it. So Chinese food seems to innovate within stronger constraints, perhaps. If so, why?
Hi, Sam. Nice to hear from you again after so many years. Well, yeah. So it's a really good question. So do I think innovation in the Chinese food world is deeply different than the Western? So I would say, like, I think of the axis as being the part of the world that is touristed by people who speak English and are fine dining eaters, right? So Peru is one of them. Japan increasingly is one of them. Obviously, all of the EU is part of it. Obviously, America is part of it. I think innovation in the Chinese food world, to my very limited understanding of it, is different from that because China has been, like Japan was until fairly recently, very illegible to the English-speaking world, right? So you could go there, but you don't speak the language, and they weren't necessarily trying to help you understand it. Exactly like if you went to, so I started going to Japan in the probably mid 2000s, actually early 2000s. I was going there to do research on food actually. And when you went there, you had to learn an entirely new vocabulary for what the food even is, let alone a vocabulary for how to think about why it is good. Not only the materials, but the aesthetics. And I think that China actually has a similar, very, very long, very elaborated aesthetic history, as well as a very long and elaborated material history that is very, very hard to see and understand if you're not actually from that culture. And as a result, you kind of see anything that is partly an aesthetic production exercise in China looks very different, and it seems to innovate, Sam, as you point out, within stronger constraints than in other places where they just don't have as much of this domination by history, right? And so if you look at sort of the tradition of Chinese classical painting, until very, very recently, you could only paint in a certain way, and then you could do a lot of innovation inside that way, but unless you were quite well schooled in the canon and the aesthetic tradition of that canon, you could not even see the nature of the innovation. And that's what's really interesting about innovation itself. It's always relative to the context in which it exists. So things become new relative to where they have to be new. And so, to draw another connection out to normal food, like a lot of the things that are innovation in fine dining are not actually brand new to the world. They come into the world of fine dining from industrial cooking, right? So things like spherification, which was very big in the, I would say, late 90s, early 2000s. That was not something which El Bulli came up with. They actually went to a company that did industrial scale texture modifications so that you could produce food at large scale and keep the texture consistent. And then what they said was, oh, you can change the texture of something that is edible. What can we do with the idea of changing the texture so that we can produce food that is fine and refined, like fine dining could be? And what that meant was doing something which industrial food had never done before, which is to create, for instance, a globule that is a liquid that has two different textures, one of which is firm, that encapsulates one that is not firm, right? So those are the spherifications that El Bulli became very famous for, maybe too famous for. So I think the thing about innovating within stronger constraints, I don't know if they're stronger, they're just different. And all innovation everywhere happens within constraints that are contextually specific. And so we just happen to look at the Chinese context and think that they are very different from, because they are very different from, the ones that we're more familiar with, which are the Western ones and the Peruvian ones, and increasingly, and I would say this is only in the last 5 or 6 years, the Japanese ones as well.
I'm just thinking there's a lot of hope in there for people, for home chefs, like cooking in their own kitchens during lockdown. But I think it's good place to call time, because I think we're coming through time. This has been incredibly dense. I'm personally edified, gentlemen. Being a first-time mom returning to the workplace, I'm hurtling towards a whole bunch of uncertainty and kind of creating my own scope of being the change. Ordinarily, we would all adjourn to the bar, but currently we are all at the bar and everybody else is behind the screen.
I think Vaughn wants to spend some time in Beyond's innovation R&D team. How you do innovation. I think that's my takeaway from this.
Yeah. So thank you all so much for joining us for this fireside chat. Although there's no fire in Singapore, and it'll be a while before we can resume events at the clan. But thank you so much, Cynthia and Chelsea. And if you do have questions about coming, do ping Cynthia and Chelsea, and they will help you out. And if you like what you see and you'd like to stay in touch, sign up for our mailing list on projectfeed.sg, and we will see you again. So,
Fantastic. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, everyone.
Enjoy the day that's ahead. Thank
See
you all.
you. Bye-bye.